Would you be able to kind of give the listeners I guess, what would the origin story be for MS-13? And just, I'm not sure if you know this, but I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, and I grew up in the '90s in the heavy gang era. During that time, we started to hear more about MS-13 and how violent they were in the LA streets. Started having friends getting jumped, stabbed, shot. The Colombian necktie kind of came back in the LA area at the time, which was known to be done at the time. Before that was more of a Colombian thing, but it seemed that the MS-13 started doing violent crimes just as, and anyone listening, Colombian neckties is kind of slitting someone's throat and pulling their tongue out of that opening. And you were starting to see more violent and graphic deaths, all associated to gang violence, but mainly so MS-13. And so I did grow up in an area that did have that, and I didn't know until later on the whole story. And so, if you don't mind, would you be able to kind of give us a brief explanation of the origin of MS-13?
Yeah, I mean, sort of thumbnail sketch of where they came from is largely a result of this sort of constant flow of people in and out of the United States. So this kind of sort of pattern of immigration. The first wave of immigration comes in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and that's from El Salvador and different parts of Central America to Los Angeles, in particular. And in Los Angeles, they lived in some of the most dense areas where they were in, I guess, sort of competition, if you will, with other ethnicities and nationalities, in particular the Mexican, and sort of Mexican origin gangs, let's say, that were
Yeah.
already operational in those spaces. So in LA, in those dense areas during this time period, lots of tumult, lots of competition, and they emerge in that atmosphere. At first, as kind of a group that was very fascinated with, as many of these groups are, with music. You know, a lot of them start around sort of sports organizations or those sort of collective interests. In their case, it was music, and it wasn't just any music; it was heavy metal music.
Yes.
So they were very interested in heavy metal music. And one of the first cliques, they called themselves the Stoners, and, these sorts of things. They had long hair, they bobbed it up and down, all that sort of things. That was, they looked for those means by which they could connect with one another. One would be of, your origin, your country of origin, your language, of course. And then there's other interests aside from that. And it was music. But over time, due to a lot of this sort of living in this competitive environment, they evolved. They evolved into this hyper-violent, quasi-social, quasi-criminal organization that, becomes a sort of major force, especially in these very dense areas in Los Angeles, and begins to compete for space, criminal economies, and other things that are happening inside of Los Angeles. They start to be arrested in large numbers, incarcerated, then connected to some of the other sort of larger, bigger criminal structures that exist in the area, most notably the Mexican mafia, and their collective of gangs they call the Sureños, which are all the sort of Southern California gangs. So they become part of this larger network inside the prison system. And then when they're let out, and it sort of coincides with the Clinton administration's push to change a lot of the laws, they're deported in mass, in huge numbers, in the thousands. They're pushed back to their countries of origin, Central America. And lo and behold, they find very fertile terrain in which they can export their gang activities and their name, their brand name. So you find, in particular, MS-13 and 18th Street being exported in mass to Central America and reforming there, reconstituting themselves there in an image that is a facsimile of what they'd been doing in the United States, but even more violent. They found an even more sort of, open terrain for them to operate with, tremendous impunity over many, many years. And they formed, and they create these structures that have, almost, challenging the state in many instances in places like El Salvador, which is a very small country about the size of Massachusetts. So it's not like it doesn't have to, it's that they don't have to occupy a huge amount of space in order to have a huge amount of impact. And that was what was happening in places like Central America over many, many years.
Yeah, and growing up in the in the LA area in the San Fernando Valley, those who understand kind of the gang culture, La M, the Mexican mafia, essentially was kind of in a hierarchy on top of everyone, and the Sureños were kind of the foot soldiers. Most Latino gangs, almost all of them who paid homage to the M, took the 13 as a sign. The 13th letter in the alphabet is the M, so you have MS-13, and you have a lot of the trece on a lot of the names of the southern gangs. 18th Street, you mentioned earlier, is the only one that had enough respect and notoriety that they were allowed to keep their 18. But it's a very interesting prison kind of culture that kind of spills over into the streets. And everyone in that Sureño space was trying to gain attention by the mafia, by the Mexican mafia, as like the guys who are respected. And from what I was raised to understand was part of the violence that the MS-13 would ensue on is because of gaining more notoriety and creating fear within the communities that they were the top bad dudes, and to include 18th Street in that same kind of conversation. What I didn't know was during that time of my growing up and being around it and seeing it, was that when people were getting deported, they're going back to El Salvador. The gang that was started here in LA is now wreaking havoc in the country of El Salvador. In from people, individuals who haven't spent much time in their own country, but are now getting deported to that country and having to kind of find their way in a country that most of them don't really even know because they're raised in LA. Fascinating to see. And throughout the years, how did the MS-13 gang gain so much power in El Salvador?
It didn't happen overnight. They start out sort of slowly usurping the power of local gangs, because there were a large number of local gangs already operational in those areas. So that was a process. Then they start to get incarcerated in mass in similar ways that they were incarcerated in mass in places like California. And then inside prison, they're the lowest in the totem pole. So they're abused, they're raped, they're pushed aside, So then there was a process whereby they start to gain power inside the prisons. And then that's really where they begin to sort of launch their power is from prisons, because, in the early 2000s, the Salvadoran government, and the other governments in the region as well, Guatemala and Honduras, launch their first efforts at, what they call sort of an iron fist policy, the mano dura, iron fist policies, in which they are incarcerating increasingly high numbers of suspected members of gangs. And, they use very kind of flimsy evidence to haul huge numbers of them into the prison system. And it's from the prison system where they begin to kind of reorganize and reconstitute themselves, sort of establish this very clear hierarchy. The prisons are the place where the sort of board of directors, if you will, of the MS-13 in El Salvador operates from. And they start to create this sort of systematic way in which they extort the bus system in El Salvador. So they start to get a regular revenue stream. They start to take over spaces where drug peddling is going on. So while they are not the ones that are peddling the drugs, they're collecting the money from the people who are peddling the drugs, which goes by, different names depending upon where you are, traqueteros or tracatos or tracks or whatever, you hear different names. But the bottom line is that they're collecting money from that operation as well. They get involved in contraband, and they start to evolve as criminal organizations do. As they extort more and more, for example, buses, then, like you've seen, in many a television show, it comes to the point where the owner doesn't have any more money. So then the people who are extorting them says, well, then give me, a percentage of the ownership in the bus cooperative, or whatever company it is they're extorting. So you see that starting to happen as well. And so they start to have more economic power, and then subsequently also more political power. They're able to sort of, a lot of times through their use of violence, kind of get the governments to, negotiate or at least engage with them, and give them certain concessions inside of the prison system. So you see them kind of evolve and just become a more and more powerful force in these countries, in particular in El Salvador.